Great. So let's transition now. One of the, I think, really exciting aspects of the core topics is that we get to bring in additional expertise, both within the NoCo land management agency family, as well as from external to the land management agencies. And the core topic subcommittee had a chance to interview, gosh, I didn't count it up, but I'd say it was at least 15 to 20 different people around issues of wildlife management. And that was really enriching. And from that, we had to really distill it down for the purposes of this meeting today, but are really confident that we've got some great perspectives to share who will help us cover, I think, the wide range of considerations we heard in those interviews. Our panelists are COURTNEY Larson with the Nature Conservancy. She's a conservation scientist. SUZANNE O'Neill, who's executive director with Colorado Wildlife Federation, and SHANNON, who's senior wildlife biologist from the Northeast region of CPW. We're going to be engaging with them for the next hour or so in discussing key wildlife issues for the region, along with potential principles to consider in cross-jurisdictional management. We're going to ask COURTNEY, SUZANNE, and SHANNON to speak a bit to maybe some successful partnerships they've seen and what made them successful. And we're going to ask them specifically to offer some advice around where they think NoCo should really focus in the next 1 to 2 years, 5 to 10 and beyond, with that eye towards building a longer term kind of strategic coordinated effort on wildlife management. So this panel will go for about an hour, 15 minutes maybe. It'll start with me moderating, asking some questions, getting us going, but then we really welcome and encourage questions and comments in the chat box. And I'll be monitoring for that, but I'm gonna also be asking Steve and Jonathan to help a bit with that. Drop those in. We can also take some hand raising, but give us a little time to warm up here and hear from our panelists, and then I'll let you know when we're really transitioning to taking that general Q&A. So with that in mind, I also should note Jonathan sent along short bios for our panelists this morning by email, so we'll let you take a look at those as you need to. Okay, so first of all, COURTNEY, SUZANNE, SHANNON, thank you for joining us and telling us everything we possibly need to know about wildlife management. It's a small task, right? We're really framing the discussion today around cross-jurisdictional issues, but to get there, we want to start with just some opening responses from each of you as to what you see as being the key wildlife issues. Details and examples are welcome. You know, we've heard already this morning specific examples of specific species and projects. So anything that you want to draw upon to help illustrate where you think the main wildlife issues lie for the NoCo region would be really helpful. And I'm gonna just maybe start with COURTNEY. COURTNEY, can you kick us off?
Sure, and I just want to start by thanking this group for inviting me to join you today, and also for everyone who spoke earlier. It was really helpful in just getting an idea for what kinds of issues you all are facing and what you're already doing in this space. So I guess I will start by saying that most of my background has been more specifically focused on the issue of recreation and effects on wildlife. And so that is largely going to inform my comments today, probably more so than other aspects of wildlife management. And I think one of the main topics that I really want to talk about today is just the broad topic of connectivity and how important that is for wildlife movement. And as we're looking forward into a world affected deeply by climate change, we know that connectivity is crucial to allow for measures of adaptation to climate change. So I see a focus on connectivity really working well with the topic of recreation effects on wildlife, because I see kind of a need for this landscape level planning that you all are talking about, definitely applying to both recreation and sort of climate change adaptation, and also recreation, you know, connecting trails for people across a larger landscape. And so I think trying to look at these issues that really apply across a large landscape kind of holistically is going to be really, really key. I mean, it's a big challenge, but I think an important one. And so, yeah, I guess I would just really, really emphasize the need to look beyond boundaries like you guys are already doing, and kind of more, to be a little more specific with recreation. I think a key part of planning for recreation is, of course, to identify areas that are really important for wildlife and kind of, you know, try to avoid those areas with recreation, but to look not only within your own county or jurisdiction, but to see, you know, try not to have a situation where the area that you're kind of setting aside as a core wildlife area be right up against the boundary of somebody else's high use trail right across the county line. That's not going to be as effective as if you can try to work together on designating those areas that are more targeted towards wildlife conservation. And yeah, so, and trying to identify at a landscape scale the areas that are really popular and really important and valued for recreation, and then where those areas are that are core wildlife areas that need a little bit more protection. I think those are kind of the broad themes that I want to talk about today. So maybe I'll let someone else go for now, but we can certainly circle back to some of those ideas in more detail, if that's all right.
Yeah, that sounds great, Courtney. Why don't we ask Suzanne and Shannon to respond to that kind of high level question? And then I'm going to dig in with a couple more questions to follow up. Suzanne, go ahead.
Okay, I'll start. So as you're looking forward, which I think this group is just ideal, I think we're multi-jurisdiction, across jurisdiction, look to review and determine the sensitive blocks of habitat that really need to be conserved, that need to remain intact. You know, if we think about big game habitats, we're thinking about migration areas. Sometimes they're not quite corridors, but they're more areas. Production or birthing areas, severe winter range, which the way CPW defines it means where 90% of the individual animals are located, where the snowpack is at a maximum and the temperatures are at a minimum for 2 out of 10 years. And winter concentration areas, similarly, the part of the winter range where densities are at least 200% greater than the surrounding winter range. So we're not saying the entire winter range, which right away will be of great concern to user groups because they'll think, oh, you're blocking out all the winter range. No, not true. You're looking at the critical areas. And then with summer concentration areas, sometimes around the state, we'll find a network of trails that isolates a herd or a group of animals by encircling part of it with trails and trail connections. So in looking forward, if we can look first at the wildlife science and determine these blocks, then we can follow with the future planning on the social science level to figure out where it makes sense to locate additional trails or where trails need to be realigned. So an example would be a small isolated herd of bighorn sheep. And this does occur some places where if it's a non-migratory herd and a trail's going to cut through part of it, that's going to be a problem for a small isolated herd. If it's a migrating herd, but it's small and has some issues, if you cut off part of its very small severe winter range, that's going to be a big problem. So again, if multi-jurisdictional, we can figure out where these places are. There are a lot of data, maps to inform this decision making, and I can go through all these data sources like the new codex with the through the Colorado Natural Heritage Program. It's in 10 states, and now through a partnership with CPW, it'll be in Colorado. That will be huge. CPW's maps, the Forest Service maps. There's just a lot of information out there for your land use staffs to look at and collaborate to get this one piece together and then move from there so we can avoid and minimize big impacts on sensitive wildlife areas in the future.
Thanks, Suzanne. And Shannon, just the opening general question to you of the key issues. And I know you had mentioned earlier that one key issue is recreation. So if you want to say more about that, that would be great, or elaborate on other issues as well. We welcome that too.
Sure. Thank you for having me. As I think through all these different issues and I'm thinking through our success stories, I'm supremely confident that the only way we're going to address these is through collaboration. And so, you know, a day like today is a perfect example of, and I'm hearing all these ways where we overlap and where our interests are, and it's just really exciting for me. So thank you for having me here. So like you said, Julie, I already talked about one of the key issues that I think are facing all of us, and then us in particular in CPW, and that's learning how to manage people on the landscape and wildlife on the landscape so that we have sustainable wildlife populations into the future. And that connects to what Suzanne said. I mean, a big part of that is understanding habitat and protecting habitat and restoring habitat for wildlife. And you know, same as what Courtney said, there's connectivity things. You know, we have to look on a bigger scale, even outside of our own boundaries of Colorado, and think about wildlife from a broader scale, because that does contribute to the sustainability of wildlife, is looking at a big scale. This is encouraging that, you know, we're looking at northern Colorado, but, you know, we're obviously connected to other parts of Colorado, and thinking about this landscape approach to how we're going to manage people and wildlife is to me the key to success. And when I talk about managing people and wildlife, it's managing people's time and space in wildlife habitat as it relates to current development, proposed development, and looking 20 years down the line. And I'm pretty focused on, like I said, sustainable recreation and sustainable wildlife populations, so that, you know, people do have enjoyable experiences outdoor. I mean, we want people to love being outdoors and love wildlife. So how do we connect making sure we're being responsible to our wildlife populations and implementing management strategies that manage people in a way that they accept it? To me, that's a big part of this whole thing, is we need people to understand their role in how to preserve landscapes and how to be around wildlife. I'm convinced almost every person you ask out in the wild or out on public land would tell you they love wildlife and they want to see wildlife. And if you told them they had a negative impact on it, they would want to know why and how they could mitigate that. And so a key issue, I think, is helping the public understand relevant science that articulates what we're saying and how they accept ownership into providing sustainable populations or sustainable recreation. I don't think as land managers or wildlife managers we can do it by ourselves. I think we need people wanting to be a part of the solution and accepting how they can be a part of it. And part of that is our job in making our science relevant or our recommendations relevant and educating people. It's easy to do a research project and come up with recommendations, but if you don't make it relevant to people and where their role is in helping you advance that, then that's not finishing it through to making it applicable. So key issues are managing people and wildlife on the landscape together for sustainable uses, and then helping people understand what their role is in that. And a part of that is science. We have some science, as you know, Jonathan provided that list of literature, and there's a lot out there. There's a lot we still need. I mean, I think it's our responsibility to continue to identify areas where we need more science to articulate what's going on. And then another key issue is funding. You know, we need to develop ways that can fund either science or fund the application of management strategies. I mean, we all know that there's a level of education and enforcement that goes along with a lot of our recommendations, and those have to be in place for things to be successful. So that funding piece is a huge part of advancing and overcoming some of these challenges that I see. And just, I guess I glossed over some of where I'm coming from on this, is that I worked for 10 years in Summit County. So I got to work with people and wildlife in a really small geographic area. You know, Summit County is close to Denver, and so close to the Front Range. And so it's probably the busiest county outside of the northern, Front Range. And so I did a lot of work with people and wildlife and land use departments and the Forest Service. And then I've spent the next 10 years of my career on the Front Range. And so been intimately involved with people in wildlife. And I have a firm understanding of the collaboration that's needed to really advance what we do as an agency, but also my interest, just in wildlife and people. So thanks again for the chance to be here.
And thanks to all three of you. I have a million questions, and I'm going to try to distill them down. And again, we're going to get to a lot of questions from NoCo members soon too. But I want to follow up on bits and pieces of different things you each mentioned, and maybe ground us a little bit more in some details as well. The first set of questions I have are really around helping us better understand what are the current trends for wildlife in this region, and how do recreational impacts relate to that. So it's a little bit of a twofer, but I think one thing we haven't covered yet is, what's happening with wildlife. Do you already see declines in species of interest? And could you say more about that? So let's leave it there, and then I'm going to ask specifically about recreational impacts to wildlife in a moment. But could anyone, Shannon, Suzanne, or Courtney, just kind of give us a really quick state of the wildlife kind of address here of what is going on with NoCo right now? What is going on with the NoCo region right now in terms of wildlife and what we're seeing?
Be happy to jump in on that. It's kind of a mixed bag as far as what's going on with wildlife. Interestingly enough, there are populations that are doing really well in the face of people in recreation. And when I say well, that means there's a lot more of them on the landscape. That doesn't mean they're actually behaving the way we want them to behave. Urban areas, as we develop urban areas, either from a housing standpoint or trails, it impacts wildlife behavior and populations. And in some parts of northern Colorado, we're finding changes in behavior where we have elk that used to be, taking a big game species specifically, they used to be migratory, which allowed, habitat to recover. And now we're seeing a change, in numerous species where these species are no longer moving and they're causing habitat damage. They're also causing conflicts with people, whether that's on roadways or whether that's on crops or whether that's just in the backyard or with their pets. So when I say they're doing better, well, it's not what we want them to do, but their numbers aren't declining. Their numbers are actually increasing. And that can be small mammals and big mammals. And so I think we have provided opportunities for animals to live more safely without, predation and that type of thing. And it's changed their behavior. I mean, on a broad scale across the Northern Front Range, most of our species are doing well at some population level. There are some, some species that, we have some concerns about. Bats are one of them, that's one of the species. But it's really managing where they're at on the landscape rather than their population level that we're trying to deal with. And that's where the issues can arise. they're not doing what they have traditionally done over the last 30 years. And their placement and their timing there is ultimately what we're trying to manage. And then as an agency who, you know, primarily manages numbers through harvest, you know, we have a lot of challenges on the Front Range, being able to manage those numbers to a sustainable level for the habitat and for reducing conflicts and trying to overcome them. And a lot of people on this call know exactly what I'm talking about and have been key to our success in being able to manage these animals on the landscape. But that will be something, you know, that's something that does influence, you know, how populations are doing, and something we're working on.
Thanks, Shannon. Suzanne or Courtney, either of you want to add anything more, specifically staying just on this question of what trends are we seeing in wildlife? How are they doing?
I'll mention one, and that is grassland birds are declining, and particularly ground nesting birds, as we have more and more development along the Front Range. So western meadowlark, obviously the state bird, the lark bunting, it's not all that common to see them anymore, many other species. So I just wanted to note birds in the discussion.
Thank you. Courtney, let me pitch a question specifically to you, getting a little more granular on recreation impact. So all of you have mentioned that interplay, and obviously it was a big theme throughout the discussion earlier this morning, and a big consideration for NoCo with increasing population on the Front Range and increasing visitation. So you have conducted a study looking at recreation impacts, and my question is if you could sum up some of the key takeaways of how different kinds of recreation impact wildlife, and then also make sense of that for us, of whether parsing out those individual impacts is important at this landscape level or not. You know, how would you say that information should be used? So first on what are the different recreation impacts that you've studied and learned about, but then how should we contextualize that on a landscape scale?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. So the piece of research that I think Julie is talking about is a literature review that I did, trying to synthesize across a lot of different papers on this topic of recreation effects on wildlife. And I think some of the main takeaways from that work is, I mean, the first and sort of broadest thing is that we found a very high rate of recreation having effects on wildlife. And overall, 93% of the articles I looked at found at least one effect of recreation on wildlife, and most of those effects were negative. But there was a huge variability in, you know, what species were being looked at, what types of recreation, what the habitat context was. And so, I mean, one of the things that this study showed to me is just the immense variability that there is in this topic, and also the gaps in knowledge that we still don't understand that well. So kind of bear that in mind, that the research is pretty uneven and varied, and there's actually quite a few contradictions in the literature about, you know, some groups have found certain types of effects and then other studies haven't in similar situations. But kind of looking across recreation activities, what we saw were more frequent effects of winter recreation. Although I'll note that there were fewer papers on winter recreation overall, so there's kind of a small sample size effect. But I think, you know, that's definitely an area where we need to think carefully, and probably more research is needed, but definitely an area of real importance to northern Colorado, of course, with all the winter recreation that goes on. I will say, in terms of, I get asked a lot about kind of parsing out differences between effects of hiking and mountain biking in particular, but maybe also horseback riding, these kind of like terrestrial activities that a lot of times take place on multiple use trails. And I guess what I would say to that is it's very hard to parse those out because they are often occurring in the same places. And I guess I would also say I'm not I'm not sure how productive it is to go really fine scale on the differences between hiking and mountain biking, given that these activities do occur in kind of similar places and could be kind of considered more broadly like, you know, non-motorized terrestrial recreation. I think it might be more productive to think about kind of categories of recreation. So you have your like non-motorized trail-based activities, but then there, you know, there's that's the effects of that kind of activity are really different than something like backcountry skiing that takes place in a different season. Visitors or skiers are dispersed across the landscape and not, you know, staying to trails typically. Maybe they're in a certain area, but they're actively seeking to be in areas away from other people. And so that kind of use is really quite different, and I think probably has really different effects on wildlife. So I guess I would encourage that sort of categorization rather than, because I think it takes a lot of resources to narrow down on parsing out those really particular differences, and sometimes can kind of pit user groups against each other too. I guess that's my opinion on that after being asked a lot about those differences. One other thing I'll highlight is that from my literature review, we didn't see a big difference in at least the frequency of effects of recreation when looking at motorized and non-motorized recreation. And this was something that was really surprising to us, and it's something I get asked about a lot. And I'm certainly not gonna make a claim that, you know, motorized recreation doesn't have effects. I think there were a couple of things we weren't really able to account for, such as the spatial spread of motorized activities. But I think what this overall emphasized to me is that it's easy to assume that motorized activities have a larger and more damaging effect and really put a lot of focus on that. And I think it is important to look at that, but I think it's also important not to ignore the effects of non-motorized recreation, because that is also affecting wildlife. So I think that's probably good for now.
That's great. I'm sure there's a lot to unpack there. I might let folks in the Q&A kind of ask you more specifics, but let me ask Suzanne, do you want to add, I know you've thought a lot about recreation impacts, and just anything else from either data or, you know, or your work in this field that you'd want to add around the specific impacts of recreation?
Well, there was a study in the Vail Beaver Creek area on the impact of people roaming around calving areas, elk calving areas, and the researchers found there was a significant disturbance problem there that impacted the calving, the reproduction. That's one study that will appear in the literature reviews. Dr. Wisdom has studied impacts also, not in Colorado, but they were primarily in a forest in Oregon. And he was trying to parse the differences, although I agree with Courtney, trying to figure out the difference between motorized and then less impact from mountain bikes and less impact from hikers. But that's all based on disturbance from a trail, as opposed to the larger need to conserve these blocks of habitat, so we find less of those situations, at least for future planning. We're also concerned about e-bikes. BLM is in the process of, we all just commented maybe a month ago on proposed rules. And the e-bikes, as the technology improves, are going to go farther and faster and later in the day into sensitive habitat along trails. So we're really concerned about that. And Aaron can speak to where the Forest Service is in that process, but I wanted to mention that as well.
Great, thank you. And Shannon, anything else you want to add from kind of the research side on recreation impacts, whether, you know, specific to kind of certain uses or otherwise?
The question is a great question, because Currently, we have several different research projects going on to better understand recreation and its impacts on different species on the landscape. And those involve game cameras, those involve radio collars of adult animals and young animals. And as you know, it's a fast changing landscape, and the number of uses on the landscape, you know, these e-bike things, we weren't even talking about those really, you know, years ago, or the year-round mountain biking with the fat tires. It's hard to get ahead of it and understand it to control it at times, but we have dedicated a lot of effort recently in several different deer and elk studies to look at different recreation types, and you'll see a nexus to a lot of the work, you know, that's already been done with COURTNEY and flight distances, and you know, does it have a more significant impact during critical times like calving or wintering? Because in contrast to northern Colorado, we do have areas of the state where we do think recreation has had a significant impact in population level impacts on wildlife. And it's all types of recreation, from non-motorized to motorized, to potentially even, you know, having hunters and more hunters in the backfield insert. So, I mean, it's everything. It's just more people, really, is what it is. And so in contrast to where we're talking, we do have some concerns about population level impacts. And the Glenwood Aspen area is one that we're focusing some efforts on. So there's a lot we don't know about specific recreation types. And COURTNEY brings up a good point about, you know, maybe we should, you know, get away from fine scale looking at recreation types. You know, for us, a lot of times looking at critical habitats by species and mapping is what allows us to make our statements on management as it relates to recreation, because it is hard for us to say that a dog walker versus a jogger versus an e-bike is less or better or whatever, because it just depends on the time of year and the species. And so for us, we have a continual effort of mapping our species and understanding their critical habitats, and, you know, what's left of them, where are they intact, what's the relative importance on a population level. And so that's ongoing. And then you add in our current need for more information on recreational types as it relates to wildlife across the state that we're working on.
Great. I'm just gonna, before I leave this question generally about recreational impacts, and I assume we'll come back to it even more later, but there's a couple of questions in the chat that I'll just try to weave in here. There's a question about, are there any studies to show impact due to distance traveled in the backcountry? E-bikes was one of the things that this person was thinking about. So are there any truisms or any clear conclusions about distance traveled? And given that there's always new technologies emerging, and another example from the chat is drones, you know, are there particular technologies you're concerned about, or how do you think about the future? Shannon, you may have answered that a little bit by saying focus on the habitat, not the recreational types, but are there any things we know for sure? And how would others encourage us to think about emerging recreational technologies?
I'll jump back in, or no, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say that I mean, it's always going to be difficult to anticipate what the next thing is and what the next technology is. But I do think that kind of a general trend is that as populations grow and trails and trailheads get crowded and people are seeking more solitude, more technologies are developing that allow and make it easier for people to get deeper into the backcountry. And so e-bikes are definitely an example of that. And so I think I think we should just anticipate that some of those areas that right now are really inaccessible to people may become more accessible due to developing technology.
Thanks, COURTNEY.
I would agree with COURTNEY that I think there are places where wildlife anticipate seeing people and having people recreate, and they behave differently than areas where they don't anticipate or they haven't seen people before. And so these different technologies allow people to spread out on the landscape and there are less places where nobody is, right? And so that is an impact at some level, and the different technologies, like Courtney said, are really what allow people to get into areas. And, you know, I mean, there's stuff that I can say anecdotally on wildlife that I don't have a study to tell me that, you know, I'm exactly right. But, you know, I've been flying bighorn sheep over the Continental Divide for almost 18 years. And there are areas where I never saw a single person ever on the landscape, especially in the winter. And this past winter, flying, seeing 6 people and a dog backcountry skiing, and I saw 0 bighorn sheep. And it's a place where I saw bighorn sheep every year previous to that. So I don't have a study to tell me that those skiers likely had some level of impact on bighorn sheep, but I can guess that their presence in an area where traditionally people haven't been had some level of impact to them. And so those are some of the things that, you know, we don't have the time necessarily to understand every different recreational aspect, but I can understand that in the winter, in areas where they haven't anticipated people and people have the ability to get, that it does have some level of impact to wildlife.
Thanks. Let me ask a few more kind of questions, but there's some great conversation coming in the chat too. Let's talk about studies and data writ large. Suzanne, you had mentioned earlier, you know, data sets, and I've heard everyone kind of mention, oh, there's not a study for that. And what do we have and what do we need? And how do you balance the pragmatic question of what can we do with what we have now versus, you know, where do we really need to invest if we're to make better decisions? So Suzanne, let me start with that, because you said you could, earlier you mentioned you might say a little more about data and what we've got.
Well, I mentioned Codex and CPW, the different mapping systems out there. We have the State Wildlife Action Plan. We have the Big Game Report on migration and winter ranges pursuant to the governor's executive order. And the policy document will be coming out in mid-August. We will have the updated planning trails with wildlife in mind. I don't know, it's been delayed somewhat with COVID, so they're still outlining. But that will be another source. We have a lot of studies that were in the oil and gas context in the Piceance Basin, which talked about buffers needed during the daytime, during the nighttime, depending on noise and disturbance. That's where CPW has devoted a lot of resources and done a great job. So those are some sets. We also have CPW's best management practice recommendations for land use. And there is a lot of material in there in terms of, if you can't, you know, try to avoid through the identifying and setting aside these big blocks of habitat, but also if you need to be in the posture of minimizing, how do you do that? They'll recommend seasonal closures and obvious things like keeping dogs on leashes. So it spans, but there are many, many species contained in these recommendations that also would be helpful. And that's based on CPW's field best expertise on the ground, developed over the years and updated.
Thanks, Suzanne. Shannon or Courtney, or both, do you want to speak at all to what data do we have, what data do we need, what and as well as other resources and information?
Yeah, I can add to that. Maybe less on the level of specific data sets, but kind of more on research topic areas. So I guess some of the places where I see a need for more information, one would be kind of about levels of recreation and identifying where there are thresholds in levels of use that really start to affect wildlife. The problem with this and what makes it really challenging is, I think, kind of as Shannon mentioned, it really varies for different wildlife populations. So, you know, the the elk that are in Estes Park and are really accustomed to people, their threshold for disturbance is going to be very different than an elk herd living, you know, in a more remote area that doesn't experience people nearly as often. So I do think that there's not gonna be hard and fast thresholds that apply across the board. But at the same time, I do think there's a need to know, well, you know, is low use okay, and what is low use? And then I also see a real need for kind of testing of management actions and strategies that can be used to mitigate effects of recreation. Like I know that, you know, seasonal closures are something that is beginning to being used during the breeding season or during winter or during calving season. And I haven't seen a lot of kind of studies that really look at how well those types of closures work. And so I think we need more research into kind of laying out kind of what are our options for managing and mitigating effective recreation, and how well do they work. And obviously that's a tall order, but would give us a lot more power and choices about what to do for these problems.
Let me jump in, and Shannon, you can follow up further, because that's a really nice segue to the other question I wanted to ask, and it's reflective as well of what's been coming in the chat, because there's a lot of questions around how you unite the social science and the, you know, the wildlife science, and which comes first, right? Is it that so someone in the chat mentioned, it seems like we approach, you know, recreation first from the human user perspective, and then try to adjust for wildlife. And what would it look like if we thought about wildlife first? What would we be doing in terms of managing human behaviors? So I kind of want to put that out there and ask for any examples of, you know, what we know about effective behavior management for wildlife, and what we know might work, what we've seen hasn't worked. So any case studies on that too. Shannon, do you want to try to answer that first?
Yeah, I'll try to use some specific examples of kind of some success stories. And I like the idea of looking at what's there for wildlife and the habitat, and then trying to decide how to manage people in those habitats. And again, it goes back to either there is a lot of data out there. I mean, there really is. In this document that Fletcher and Brian are referencing over in the chat, one part of that is trying to synthesize everything out there, because sometimes there's a lot out there, but wrangling your arms around it and pulling it all together to look at has not been done on some level. So that is being done, which is a good thing. But then there's also gaps in data, and then identifying those priorities and working toward it. But some of the examples we have of being able to, you know, look at the habitat is we have several elk projects going on the Front Range of Colorado that are pretty exciting, and they involve radio collaring elk and looking at their fine scale movements and identifying the habitats that they are using, and then also identifying what's important about those habitats from a plant standpoint and other species, and then finding ways to manage those elk, and then measure the vegetation and the success around that in landscape. And, you know, Eric's on here, and we have Park Service on here. Fort Collins is a part of it. We have a lot of partners with a bunch of different colors along the Front Range, partners from Boulder County to Jefferson County to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to Fort Collins to the National Park Service. And so you want to talk about an example of collaboration, and that's really trying to use elk as an example, but it's really trying to protect the landscape. So trying to understand their movements, their habits, and then make management decisions around that. And I think it's a model in some of these areas that should be held up on a pedestal for, you know, how well it's been done in collaboration with everything, because it is looking at the wildlife and then trying to manage to protect the vegetation, but managing wildlife and people in hand in hand with one another. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question, but it is pulling data, what we can from wildlife, and identifying those habitats, and then trying to manage those in tandem with people's activities to have these sustainable habitats and sustainable populations.
Julie, could I ask Shannon a quick question?
Please do, go ahead.
My understanding is also one of the priority research areas that CPW has underway is a front range mule deer study to figure out exactly where they're moving and stopover points, because they know migration paths on a fairly coarse level and show it in their Colorado action plan. But I believe that radio collar studying is underway, and that will yield additional data in this northern Colorado area. Is that right?
Yes, Suzanne, thank you for bringing that up. That was on my list of upcoming research and an exciting opportunity. So we were awarded money in the Northeast region to do 2 different projects that are tied to Secretarial Order 3362 and the governor's executive order to look at migration routes and winter range. And if you look at where we do a lot of winter range and migration in Colorado with radio collars, traditionally it's been on the west slope, right, with the big herds and a lot more public land. But we're pretty fortunate that we get to radio collar 40 mule deer on the northern Front Range this winter. And exactly what we're talking about, we're trying to identify those critical habitats with use of radio collars. And like we've done with elk on the Front Range, we're trying to look at those fine scale movements. Are there pinch points in their migration that we should be protecting with conservation easements? Are there timing recommendations that we would make toward recreation or human activity, and really trying to protect what we have and manage what we have? So we're doing that with mule deer on the Front Range, which has not been done for over 20 years. So this is really exciting for us. And then the other project we have, which is just outside of the NoCo boundary, but it's equally important, is in South Park. So we'll put 40 radio collars on elk in South Park. And our elk in South Park are truly migratory. So they come from Summit County and Mount Evans and areas west of the highway up in the Buffalo Peaks. And so there aren't as many people in South Park yet compared to other parts of northern Colorado, but I think we can learn something with those radio collars and how we either navigate expanding highways and protecting critical corridors. So we're pretty fortunate and excited about those 2 projects that we're putting on there that will again look at the habitat so that you can manage people on the landscape.
Thanks. I'm going to turn more and more to the chat right now, but continue this kind of flow of conversation here. One is, continuing to talk about the social science dimension, just around how to effectively manage people's behavior to protect wildlife. And so one thing folks have talked about is, kind of thinking about these large blocks of land and how to conserve or preserve. And we'll come back to that in a minute based on another comment. But first, to the extent that there are people recreating on the landscape, have you studied or have you observed or are you using, in the case of Suzanne, certain kinds of messaging strategies with a broader public audience that seem to be working around managing behavior for wildlife?
It's interesting. Years ago, Dr. Rick Knight out of CSU did a study that showed that people using trails where he already knew there were disturbances from an earlier part of the study found that 50% of the people said, we don't think we're impacting wildlife at all because the wildlife weren't racing off. And I thought that was a pretty interesting study on perspectives, that would make sense for anyone who's just looking at wildlife through like windshield biology kind of thing. I did want to mention that right now we have an outside 285 project going on that is still close to the starting phase. And Clear Creek County's involved, Jeffco's involved, obviously CPW. It came about through the Colorado Mountain Biking Association. But what we're doing is first assessing habitat, right? And then figuring out where additional trails or realignments can be, so that we're capitalizing on areas with human impacts already, rather than, I hope this is where it comes out, if it's truly going to be a model, rather than forging further into some of these blocks of habitat that really need to remain undisturbed. So I just wanted to mention that that is underway. It should take about a year.
Great, thanks. Okay, so there's helping people just understand that they have an impact in the first place. That may be a step. There's the specific strategies that maybe are a little untested, Courtney, like, you know, how effective are closures. Other thoughts on effective recreation management with wildlife in mind? And Suzanne, you also brought up kind of the thinking about the wildlife first and then planning your trails. So other examples or advice from our panelists on managing recreational behavior with wildlife in mind?
I would say a key piece is bringing recreation user groups into the discussion. I know, so most of my sort of on the ground work on this topic has taken place in California. So I'm probably going to draw some examples from there. But there's been a really productive collaboration there with the San Diego Mountain Bike Association, which mountain bike unofficial trails were were and are a big problem in a lot of the open space preserves in San Diego County. And that collaboration has involved basically engaging with this mountain biking association and having volunteer days in which mountain bikers come out and work on the trails. They do trail work. They actually work to close off some of the illegal shortcut trails that have been constructed. And I think that works really well to bring people into the process, and they feel kind of a sense of ownership. And then there's more of a culture within that part of the mountain bike community of, oh, you know, we worked on this place. We want to keep this place in good condition and not allow our fellow mountain bikers, you know, to undo the work that we've done. And I think also just understanding what the different recreation groups are looking for. So if mountain bikers are looking for more miles of, you know, rolling topography, forested trails, and you say, well, we built you a new trail in, you know, the prairie. It's like, well, that's not necessarily going to meet the need. But understanding what the need, so rather than mountain bikers saying, you know, we want a trail in this exact spot, and, you know, maybe you're concerned about that's a critical habitat area, but find out what the aspects of that spot are that they're looking for. So they're looking at topography and how fun it is to ride. Maybe there's another area that has similar attributes that isn't as critical for wildlife that you can kind of redirect to. So I think that piece of like understanding what people are seeking in their recreation is really important.
Hey, let me go to a different question, and folks, feel free to drop things in the chat, and you know, if we want to make it more dynamic, you can raise your hand too, and I'll call on you. So in the chat, there's a question. It takes us a little bit away from the last line of discussion on behavior management, but more to what is it that we're really focused on when we're setting kind of goals and objectives for what to preserve. It was an observation that a lot of the discussion so far has been on big game species, although Suzanne did mention birds. But what are the species or habitats or ways of thinking about conservation that are going to be most useful in this conversation? Is it you know, T&E species? Is it keystone species? Is it looking more broadly at just blocks of undisturbed landscape? How would you advise land managers, especially looking at a landscape scale, to think about organizing their priorities?
I could jump in on this, and I do think that's a fair point. I know we've focused a lot on on big game species or big animals. One, they're easier to see and easier to count than some of this other stuff. And we do have a lot of data on them. So that is one reason we sometimes default to using them as some sort of litmus test. And there's also the thinking that if you're preserving, or protecting elk habitat, you are by default protecting some of the smaller stuff, and as an agency, we collect data on big game and small game and non-game and T&E, and the status of that animal, where it's at may determine how much attention it gets or the survey type directed at it. And so I think it's kind of a mixed bag answer on the best way to look at animals. I mean, sometimes it may be that you're looking at something that's a charismatic megafauna, and people like to see wildlife, and they don't always get to see the small stuff. But I think as an agency, we collect data on everything that we have the power to, which is not everything by any means, but a lot of times if you focus your efforts on habitat types, you are capturing a broader scale diversity of species, and that likely is really the best way to do it, is to identify what's important about those habitats. And if you have the ability to census what species are there, then you work toward it. But habitat types might even be the better way to broad scale protect wildlife, because you are capturing both small and big wildlife.
Can I test that with Courtney and Suzanne? I feel like this is a theme that came out in the interviews as well, that as a principle for kind of landscape scale management, focusing on habitat types may be the better way to go than trying to focus on specific species. Suzanne and Courtney, would you agree with that?
I agree with that, but in the state wildlife, see if everybody can see it, the state wildlife action plan, which was developed collaboratively, although through CPW, there are 55 tier 1 species, and then it goes on to discuss their particular habitats. And so going back to CPW and saying, okay, I know some of these species that we have in the county or in the cross-jurisdictional area, and I'm reading about the habitats, let's talk further about it. With CPW and the Forest Service and the counties, including field managers, like where is the boreal toad population around Guanella Pass so that we stay more than 300 feet away from the breeding area. So it's a mix of identifying some of these other species, their habitats, and then really getting down to the land level to say, okay, what on this map do we have to protect? What are you finding? That's my take.
Thanks, Suzanne. Courtney?
I agree as well. And I would also add that by preserving and conserving blocks of intact natural habitats of different types, that's also going to provide a more resilience for climate change. I mean, we might know right now where the breeding areas are for certain animals, but in a few decades that may shift. And so I think just because a species, it's a critical area for a particular species now, doesn't mean it's going to be in the future, and it may be a critical area for different species. So I do think that by focusing on intact natural habitats of a variety of types and making sure that they're connected, that's building in more of that adaptive capacity.
Thanks. Feel free, again, if folks have other questions. I'd kind of maybe just stick on this theme of what could we say almost at a principle level of guidance for land managers working across a landscape. So one principle, for example, may be around focusing on connectivity and large intact landscapes while not losing sight, Suzanne, as you said, when needed on the specific species there. Another might be, Courtney, you know, to your point earlier, rather than trying to parse out every single recreational impact, kind of thinking more categorically about recreational impacts. keeping climate change in mind. So not just the spatial, but the temporal, aspects of wildlife management and how those might change with changing climate seems to be something that's come up in various ways. Are there other things you would say, and this is a question to any of the panelists, in terms of kind of core principles for thinking about landscape level management?
Well, another one is setbacks from water bodies. How far away should the disturbance be? And, for wetlands, for playas, for streams, for lakes, depending on the area and the needs. But I think we should mention water bodies as well. Some of it is an impact of sedimentation, some could be an impact of pollution. Some of it's aesthetic, of course. So anyway, let's add that in there too.
Great. And I see actually a note in the chat, I think is somewhat related, saying, looking at large blocks is useful, but you also have to consider multiple scales, including when you're thinking about aquatic species. What else would you add, Shannon or Courtney? Any other kind of overarching principles of thinking about landscape scale management for wildlife? Sounds like, to fill in a few more that I heard, kind of thinking about the testing of assumptions around what we're managing for in terms of recreational behavior. So a principle would be, can we test and prove that our interventions are actually working? And so looking for potential data on that.
I think, Julie, you bring up a good point. I mean, there has to be some sort of measure, right? So you have to know what you have and then have a desired outcome, and then be able to measure success or, adapting change. So, along with these recommendations about spatial or temporal or setbacks and that type of thing, I do think there needs to be a commitment to some scientific understanding and commitment to knowing what's there and measuring what you're doing, and so you can learn, what works and what doesn't, and then just being adaptive in your strategies. So that principle of being committed to science and an understanding of how to capture that data and then use your data to implement those management strategies, I think is an important principle.
Thanks, Shannon. I have a final question for our panelists, but wondered, anyone else want to jump in? It could be something on a small detail or big picture question, but something you'd love to hear from our panelists while we've got them captive with us right at this moment.
Just a comment on some processes, and Shannon mentioned South Park. South Park, we decided as a community with Park County and water providers, agricultural interests, conservation interests, to all sit down in advance of a federal agency formal planning process. And actually, Julie was very involved in facilitating for an entire year, where we could look at not only our priorities, but learn from others and figure out where we could all come together in collaborative recommendations, and have the federal agency there, because at that stage, the federal agency didn't have a FACA limitation where they had to invite the world first. They could actually sit in on our discussions and serve as an information source. And I think for South Park, that's really, really helped. The final plan won't be out for a few days, but having our collaborative recommendations go through the entire process so far as a preferred alternative, I think speaks in terms of an additional model in that kind of circumstance. So I wanted to mention that.
Thanks, Suzanne. Okay, we have a couple other questions coming in. Specific question on jet noise. Anybody know about impacts of jet noise to wildlife in the high country? Are any studies out there?
I guess it's not jet noise particularly, but I know of some studies about noise impacts, and certainly a lot of wildlife rely on sound and hearing, you know, from birds having to shift the pitch of their calls to avoid interference from noise, to, you know, carnivores that rely on sound to detect prey under snow, or, you know, I mean, there's a lot of wildlife life history that relies on sound and hearing, and noise is always going to have an effect on that. So I don't know if there's, I mean, yeah, I know, like, there's definitely some research about noise impacts on wildlife, and I can dig up some of those papers for that person that was interested in that question.
Another question that came in, which I think will help us kind of round the corner to conclude this panel. So is the question of just any additional case studies. Suzanne, you just mentioned one, right, of where you felt like regional planning, kind of multi-jurisdictional collaborative approaches were helpful. Any other examples that you all would want to share around where multi-jurisdictional collaboration on wildlife has been particularly successful, and what worked? Or alternatively, any examples where it was attempted but it didn't work, and why not?
I'll jump in, Julie. As an agency, you know, we don't manage a whole lot of land. We have some state wildlife, where we have state wildlife areas, and we have parks. So we rely heavily on partnering with other land management agencies. So a big part of anything that we have, you know, as case studies is integral to many of the people that are on this call today. And so for me, a bunch of them came to mind, and one of most recent is our work with elk management and vegetation management in Boulder County. I mean, we're very fortunate to have such a great partner with Boulder County in working in collaboration for achieving management strategies that protect their property from a vegetation standpoint and manages elk on the landscape, and then allows us to manage our elk from a standpoint of being able to reduce conflicts with people, you know, either on private lands or on the highway. And so, you know, just from our agency standpoint, all the way up from, you know, the ground folks that have been working with Boulder County, all the way up, you know, through our commission even, we're really fortunate to have that great success story. And part of it is, in that collaboration, is just communication is so key. I mean, as we know, all of us have constituents that have different interests in what they want to see done with wildlife. And so communication and honesty in figuring out where we have threads of common ground, I think, is where I've seen things be successful. It's that common ground of where we're trying to go, even though we might have different guiding principles, is using that common ground to be able to get both of us there. So that elk management and vegetation management with Boulder County. Like I said, along the Front Range, we have other elk studies with Fort Collins, Larimer County, Jeffco, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that are going to be building on those same principles of Boulder County. And then just a few other examples. In Durango, our bear management involved us doing research on understanding bear activity as it related to humans and their food sources in and around their homes. And so that partnership with Durango has allowed us to apply bear management strategies to other parts of Colorado. And again, it took the understanding of, let's set our goal and how do we get there, and understand that we might be coming at it differently, but where is our common ground? And then just being honest about what you really can do from your agency standpoint. And then there's the funding. And then one more great one is the black-footed ferret. You know, we have partnership with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with Larimer County, and, you know, work with Fort Collins and landowners, you know, to work toward recovering North America's most rare wild animal is a pretty cool thing. I mean, to have that in your own backyard, but again, it takes political savvy, it takes communication, it takes funding, and really just being honest about, you know, what you're trying to accomplish that has allowed us to be really successful with all of those different species across the region.
And CPW also convened a large group a few years ago to help develop their mule deer strategy on the West Slope. And I think that was really good, because what they wanted out of it, and we all wanted out of it, were more public-private partnerships. And one way to forge that was to involve everybody in providing input into what became the strategy under their overarching strategic plan.
Okay, thanks, Suzanne. All right, I'm going to take one last comment or / question from the chat box, and then I'm going to have a kind of lightning round, like, what's your final advice for a NoCo kind of question. So this one, I think I'm just going to read it the way it was written, because I don't think I can say it better. So, if NoCo decided that we are going to protect some configuration of habitat in order to protect purple spotted skunks, how easily could we determine what levels of the human recreational impacts would be sustainable? Can you draw a line very clearly to understand what levels of recreation are sustainable? Anyone want to answer that one?
I mean, I think one way to go about a question like that would be, you know, identifying areas of habitat that this particular species, you know, relied on and lives in, and look at levels of recreation across the habitat, and kind of look at, you know, are they occupying habitat we would expect them to occupy when there's high levels of recreation, or at low levels of recreation, and are there differences? So that could be one way to kind of look across a gradient within habitat that you know is highly suitable for this species. That would be one approach on the kind of research side.
So kind of looking at the baseline of, are they doing what you'd expect them to do now, and then making your decisions from there? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anybody else? I think it's really pushing at that question of, you know, how do you manage behavior with wildlife in mind, and how do you know what the right level of management is for recreation? So it's a question that obviously we'll continue to unpack as we think about other issues of capacity and visitor use management and future core topics too. All right.
Well, that's what CPW's best management practices and recommendations for land use, that's what that gets at with many species, so that you can say, hey, if we can't avoid this habitat, how do we minimize the impact to this particular species in this habitat?
Thanks, Suzanne. Okay, well, thank you so much for all of your insights. I want to ask you that one final question on what would you advise NoCo to focus on most immediately, and then in the slightly longer term. I think you may have answered this question to some degree in various ways, but I want to give it to you as a kind of a final parting words of advice question. So what would you advise NoCo to focus on if its goal is to be thinking about how to manage you know, all of these different trends and growth and recreation, while also managing for sustainable wildlife? What do they need to focus on now? What do they need to focus on over time? Quick thoughts, parting words from you. Go ahead, Suzanne.
Future planning, I would always say focus on the biological science first, and let that guide and inform the social science about where to place the human impacts, because otherwise what we see is that if you start with the social science and the proposed projects, then that will overwhelm the wildlife biology, because it will be in a reactive mode where people are already locked into what they want to see.
Thanks, Suzanne. Courtney or Shannon?
I have two things. One I would say is that, you know, in order for us to, I guess I'd recommend to NOCO is to be inclusive of all interests. And I think any way we're going to advance sustainable recreation and wildlife is to bring everybody who is interested to the table. And I know that sounds like a huge net, but I do think people are the solution and our interested parties are a part of our solution. And so whether it's task force where you pull people together or committees or what have you, I think making sure you have the players at the table and their interests and they tell you what they want to see. I think melding those together in some sort of understanding of where you're going is very important to the acceptance in the public in advancing the strategies. So being collaborative and bringing people together. And then I think at some level there has to be a desired outcome. You know, what do we say right now this is as many people as we think we should have on the landscape? Are we saying no, we think we can have more? Or are we happy with the number of protected blocks of habitat? Do we want more? So I think you have to know what you're shooting for. So having a desired outcome, and it may not be that specific as a number of people on the landscape or number of protected habitats or what have you, but I guess my biology mind thinks about like set a goal and then measure ways to get there and then measure how you're doing on getting toward those goals. I think that's an important part of managing people on the landscape.
Thanks. Great advice from both of you. Courtney?
I have two things as well. So my first one is kind of going back to my theme about connectivity and just making sure to take a close look to identify where there are critical linkages that are for wildlife movement between core conservation areas, and then taking a close look at what's happening within those critical linkages. Are those riparian corridors that have really heavily used trails, and is that impeding wildlife ability to use those areas as movement corridors? So yeah, I think looking at those linkages and kind of having a plan, and that's going to inherently involve working across jurisdictions if you're looking at movement. And then my other point kind of builds on what Shannon was talking about with kind of bringing everyone to the table. And I think it's terrific that you're, you know, already bringing everyone who's here into a collaboration. But I think also think about partnerships that can, you know, help bring parties with different skills and abilities. So like, you know, bring in environmental and wildlife focused nonprofits that do a lot of outreach and education work already. And maybe they can, you know, help develop strategies about how to engage with recreationists on their behavior. And so you're not having to, you know, kind of do that, all of that work yourself, but you can build on others' strengths. And similarly, you know, building on social science researchers that maybe are at Colorado State University or other universities that are working on this kind of stuff. So bringing in kind of strategic partners that have skills that you need and could be a productive partnership.
Thanks to all of you for your expertise, insights, and these parting words of wise advice. It's a lot to think about, and one of the things that we're going to do in a very cursory fashion over our upcoming break is just try to get down on paper some of these kind of principles or recommendations of advice that that have come out through this conversation so that we can carry them into our breakout discussions. But there's a lot more to talk about, and we look forward to hearing from all of the NoCo members too and your reactions and takeaways from this. Speakers, you're welcome to stick with us, but if you need to run, that's okay too. Again, thank you all. And if you want to all use your hand clap function like Eric was doing, go for it. But we're definitely giving a round of applause.